Good morning, everybody. Greetings from the United States. My name is Kecskes. I am a distinguished professor at the State University of New York and an honorary research professor of Tom State University, Russia. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference, the People's Friendship University Moscow, and the QS organization for the invitation to make this presentation. Today, I'd like to talk about the differences between intracultural and intercultural communication. But before I start, I want to define what I mean by intracultural and intercultural communication. When I talk about intercultural communication, I mean interactions between members of a relatively definable speech community that follow conventions of language and conventions of usage of that particular speech community. When we talk about intercultural communication, we mean interactions between speakers who have different first languages, communicate in a common language, and usually represent different cultures. If we look at current literature about the differences between intracultural and intercultural communication, we can see that basically the dominant approach to this issue is that there is no principal difference between the two. Well, we can accept that as true as far as the mechanism of the communicative process is concerned. However, according to Gompertz and Gompertz, 2005, monolingual people and multilingual people do not differ in what they do with language, but in how they do what they do. So this is what we are interested in today. How do people do what they do with language? So my objectives today are the following. First of all, since we talk about intracultural and intercultural communication, we have to define what we understand by culture, and then discuss the nature of intercultural communication. Then after that, I'd like to present a continuum rather than a dichotomy when I explain differences between the two sides, intercultural and intracultural. And at the end of my talk, I would focus on the differences between the two from the perspective of how speakers do what they actually do. So let's start with the definition of culture. I will use the definition of Bates and Plog, 1980, because I think that that short definition actually summarizes really well what we should understand by culture. So according to that definition, culture is a system of shared beliefs, norms, values, behaviors, customs, artifacts that the members of society use to cope with their world and with one another. We should add to this something that the French philosopher Durkheim talked about. He said that culture is distributed. What he meant by that is that cultural norms and models gain individual interpretation in concrete social actions and events. So when we think about cultural models, we should imagine them as cognitive frames or temples of assumed or implicit knowledge that basically assist individuals in interpreting and understanding information and events. The important thing is that the development of these models is based on repeated prior experience of the speakers, and they guide our behavior in similar and familiar situations. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Here is a conversation from an American film, Coogan's Wolf. Clint Eastwood is the main character in this film. And here's a conversation of Clint Eastwood with a woman in a restaurant. So this kind of short conversation shows very well how cultural models can kind of clash even within one particular conversation. So they are in a restaurant and they are about to pay the bill. And the woman is leaving, so she says, I have to be going, and she's putting some money on the table. Clint Eastwood says, what are you doing? The girl says, go Dutch. That means in American English that they have to split the bill. So the response of the guy is, "You are a girl, aren't you?" There be rumors to that effect, says the girl. And then the man says, "Sit back and act like one." "Oh, is that the way girls act in Arizona?" So if you look at this sequence, we see that basically they represent two different kind of cultural models and they act accordingly. So what I'm suggesting today, when we want to explain what the differences are between intracultural and intercultural communication, that we consider that not a dichotomy, but like a continuum, a hypothetical continuum. And this hypothetical continuum has two different ends, basically. And one end is the intracultural and the other end is the intercultural end. And everything happens in between. So basically, there is no pure intracultural, intercultural communication. Everything is in between on this continuum. Either we are closer to the intracultural end and the intercultural end. I'm going to explain how these two ends differ. So if we want to answer actually our original question that was in the title, intracultural, intercultural communication, are they different? Then our answer should be yes, they are different. Why? Because in intracultural communication, in first language communication, basically what we have depends on there being commonalities, conventions, standards, and norms between speakers and hearers of a speech community. And these commonalities, norms, conventions, common beliefs, shared knowledge, and all kinds of these things all create a core common ground that speakers and hearers can always rely on. So that is basically means some kind of coherence for the given speech community. But how about intercultural communication? Do we have this kind of commonalities, conventions, and standards of the target language there? I doubt it. So we have to formulate the question for intercultural communication the following way. How do people go about formulating utterances and interpreting them when they cannot count on or have limited access to those commonalities, conventions, standards, and norms in the target language? It's very important that we are talking about target language. And in a sense, they are expected to create and co-construct them in the communicative process. So basically what we see, if we want to answer this question, that we have to talk about some different modified roads to success in the community process when we do not have access to those conventions, norms, and standards of the target language, or we have only limited access to them. If you look at the field of intercultural communication, we see that there have been several attempts to actually explain the differences between intracultural and intercultural communication. One of the best known definitions is Samovar Porter's 2001. They talked about the fact that intracultural communication is the type of communication that takes place between members of the same dominant culture, but with slightly different values, as opposed to intercultural communication, which is the communication between two or more distinct cultures. My problem with these definitions is basically twofold. There is too much emphasis on culture, and the other thing is that there is some kind of presupposition about the intercultural communication being problematic in one way or another, which may not necessarily be the case. And in fact, if you look at the literature, we see that intercultural communication as a field of inquiry was basically constituted as an analysis of understanding troubles. If you look at a quote from Newlip, we see that very clearly. Newlip said that during intercultural communication, the message sent is usually not the message received. So we have some kind of a failure approach here to intercultural communication, which is not necessarily true if you look at some studies, because several studies said that the use of semantically transparent language that non-native speakers use in intercultural communication basically results in less misunderstandings and communication breakdowns that expected. So our question should be not necessarily to look at the failures or miscommunications or misunderstandings that may occur in intercultural communication, but we have to ask the question, how do speakers in intercultural communication succeed in communicating smoothly with each other? So we should use a success approach rather than a failure approach. So this success approach aims to explicate the resources that enable participants to accomplish their community tasks and explain the way they succeed and create intercultures. In 2003, I talked about the fact that basically the insecurity experienced by lingua franca speakers, intercultural communicators, make them establish a unique set of rules for interaction, which may be referred to as intercultures, or what we see here basically, that their communicative situations are full of intercultures, which are situationally emergent and co-constructed phenomena that rely both on relatively definable cultural models and norms of the first language of the speakers, as well as situationally evolving features that are co-constructed on the spot during community encounters. So here is a typical example for developing intercultures. This conversation shows an interaction between a Brazilian woman and a Polish woman. And the Brazilian starts the conversation with a question. And what do you do? The Pole answers, I work at the university as a cleaner, as a janitor. No, not yet. Janitor is after the cleaner. You want to be a janitor? Of course. So what we see here is a kind of creation of an interculture, a kind of hierarchy that doesn't exist in the target language, in the English language. First, you are a cleaner and then you can become a janitor. But these two people who use English basically as a lingua franca, they create something that we can call interculture, that is co-constructed on the spot in order for them to have a smooth communicative process. So what we see here is that intercultural communication is basically as normal as intracultural communication. The difference is only that in intercultural communication, people may use a different emphasis, different strategies, and different approaches to success. If we go back to the continuum proposal, you remember that I proposed that when we look at intracultural communication and intercultural communication, we should talk about a continuum rather than a dichotomy. So if we accept that there is this continuum, then we have to explain the moves on the continuum, the varieties on the continuum, what do they depend on? So what affects the actual communicative situations that are on the continuum? So actually, what affects their position on the given continuum? I want to mention briefly three factors, three very important factors. I have no time for more. Of course, there are more factors that affect this position on the continuum, but I have no time for more. So let me just mention three very important ones. One of them is the idiomatic use of language. Second one is common ground, and the third one is role of context. So let's start with the idiomatic use of language. So I think that in every single human language, we have preferred ways of saying things and preferred ways of organizing thoughts. What do I mean by preferred ways of saying things? In English, we say dust the furniture, run a business, make love, shoot a film, do the dishes, and so on. So the selection of lexical items to express our conceptualization is very, very important. And of course, if you know these preferred ways of saying things and preferred ways of organizing thoughts in a language, so you basically know the idiomatic use of that language, you are like a native speaker. So that's a very important thing, because as far as second language use is concerned, and we talk about second language or third language use or fourth language use in intercultural communication, what we find in research is that there is a low rate of the target language formulas. So after all, the idiomatic use of the target language is at a low level in intercultural communication. Why is that so? Because the development of preferred ways of organizing thoughts and preferred ways of saying things requires time and conventionalization within a particular speech community. And of course, when we look at intercultural communication, we usually speak about temporary speech communities rather than relatively stable speech communities as in the first language. The second issue is about common ground. I already mentioned at the very beginning that common ground is very important for any kind of communication. Common ground basically refers to the sum of all the information that people assume they share, that they may include word use, shared values and beliefs, and the actual situational context. So when people, scholars, studies usually talk about common ground, they mean core common ground, which refers to past conventions, immediate surroundings, shared cultural background and experience of communicators, usually in the first language. Of course, we have to acknowledge that there is not just core common ground. As I talked about that in that study in 2010, I mentioned that there is what we can call emergent common ground that is co-constructed by interlocutors. And of course, that comprises something that I talked about earlier, the creation of intercultures. So if you look at intracultural communication, first language communication, and intercultural communication from the perspective of common ground, we see something very interesting and very important. As far as first language communication is concerned, I mean intercultural communication, that usually builds on existing core common ground, which is the result of prior experience of interlocutors. And they, of course, need less reliance on emergent common ground. If we go to the intercultural end of the continuum, we see more reliance on emergent common ground because interlocutors have limited access to core common ground. So actually they have to create their common ground, and they rely more on this emergent common ground than on existing common ground, which is quite limited. So this is a basic difference as far as intracultural and intercultural communication is concerned. So more reliance on core common ground in L1 communication, and more reliance on emergent common ground in intercultural communication. So the more we move to the right end of the continuum, to the intercultural end of the continuum, the more we rely on emergent common ground. The last thing what I want to focus on today is context. We know very well that as far as meaning is concerned, context is very important because it's not just a linguistic sign, but actually the situational context that also helps us to construct meaning and interpret meaning. But I think that actual situational context cannot play the role of catalyst in intercultural communication the way it does in L1 intracultural communication, because the participants have different sociocultural backgrounds. And of course, these different sociocultural backgrounds tie them to culturally different L1 communities and cultural models. So how do they understand the actual situational context is not necessarily something that they do based on the target language requirements, but rather under the influence of their existing L1-based knowledge and L1-based sociocultural background. And of course, it means that the actual situational context cannot play that very important role in meaning making it does in L1 communication. What do I mean by that? Let me just show you a very short conversation between a Korean student and the clerk in the Office of Human Resources. So Lee, the Korean student, asked the question, "Could you sign this document for me, please?" The clerk doesn't understand her very well, so she says, "Come again?" She wants the Korean student to repeat the question. Lee says, "Why should I come again? I'm here now." So, this is an actual situational context, but the actual situational context didn't help the Korean student to figure out what exactly the American clerk understood by "come again." Because the Korean student didn't know the formalic expression, period. So if she doesn't know the formalic expression in the given actual situational context, the context will not help her to figure out what exactly the meaning is. Okay, so let me summarize what I have talked about today. First of all, I started with a quote from Gompertz, who said that monolingual people and multilingual people do not differ in what they do with language, but in how they do what they do. So I use this quote to start my discussion about the differences between intracultural and intercultural communication. And I argued that there is a basic difference between the two because in L1 communication, there are conventions, commonalities, common beliefs, norms, standards, shared knowledge, and the like that actually create some kind of core common ground for first language speakers. And these speakers and hearers can rely on these factors all the time. As far as intercultural communication is concerned, participants do not have access to target language, commonalities, conventions, and common ground, common beliefs and norms the way as first language speakers do. So they basically have to co-construct them and co-create them. And of course, this means that they have different routes to success. So this is basically what we have to examine when we want to understand the differences between intracultural and intercultural communication. So I recommended that we focus on examining the way to success rather than looking at misunderstandings, miscommunications, and other things, which are absolutely relatively rare in intercultural communication, and they are not as frequent as some of the previous studies talked about that. The second very important thing that I talked about today was that if we want to understand the differences between intracultural and intercultural communication, we must imagine this thing as a continuum, a hypothetical continuum with two ends, an intracultural and an intercultural end. And basically, I emphasize that there is no pure intercultural communication, pure intracultural communication. Everything is in between these hypothetical ends. And of course, there are moves on this continuum, and there are varieties on this continuum, depending on whether we are moving to the right-hand side towards the intercultural end or the intracultural end. And I talked about three very important factors that affect the position of the given communicative situation that we want to analyze on the continuum. And these three factors were idiomatic use of language, common ground, and different role of context in intracultural and intercultural communication. Thank you very much for your attention.